This story does not start with the husband. It starts with a man holding a screwdriver. He was 53 years old. He had a computer repair shop on a town square in Missouri, and on a Thursday morning in September, he had about 10 seconds to decide whether the next sentence out of his mouth was going to cost him a 10-year friendship, his business, and possibly a lawsuit he could not afford. He was not a hero. He was not trained for this. Nobody had ever told him what to do in that particular 10 seconds, because nobody ever does. I'm Nathan, and the reason I wanted to tell you this one is that almost everybody watching will eventually get a version of those 10 seconds. You'll see something you weren't supposed to see. You'll do the arithmetic. None of my business. I could be wrong. I'd look insane. They'd never speak to me again. And most people land on silence, because silence is free, and speaking costs something immediately. Here's the part that will stay with you. The most dangerous document in this entire story is not a threat, or a weapon, or a confession. It's a spreadsheet. A boring one. Rows, dates, initials, and a column labeled position. Somebody built it the way you'd build a wedding seating chart, and it was designed to take two children away from their father in a school pickup line at 3:15 in the afternoon. The man with the screwdriver had already read row 41, and the date in row 41 was that same day. Hollow Spring, Missouri sits in a bend of the Ferris River, like something that got caught there and gave up on floating any further. 4,200 people, a courthouse with a clock that runs 11 minutes fast and has since 1974, which everyone in town has simply agreed to correct for in their heads. A square with a hardware store, a bank, an insurance office, a dentist, a diner called Rose, and a narrow storefront with a hand-lettered sign that reads Covat Computer Repair, diagnostic free. Truett Bellamy was born 8 miles outside of it, and everyone had called him True since he was 6, which he was aware was a joke the universe had set up a long time ago and let sit. He was 41. He owned a company called Bellamy Aerial and Survey, which sounds larger than it was. It was Truett, a 29-year-old drone technician named Dewey Strand, 2 survey-grade quadcopters, a truck, and a back room full of hard drives. What they actually sold was not photographs. It was proof. If a roofer told an insurance company that a hailstorm on the 9th of May tore up a warehouse roof, somebody had to be able to say what that roof looked like on the 8th. If a contractor claimed a retaining wall had moved 4 inches since the pour, somebody had to be able to prove where it had been. If 2 neighbors were suing each other over a fence line that had been argued about since Eisenhower, somebody had to fly a grid, take 1,100 overlapping photographs, and turn them into a 3-dimensional model accurate to under an inch. Truett's entire profession was one sentence. He could prove what a place actually looked like on a specific day, and he could prove when a photograph of that place had really been taken. He was good at it in a way that was not glamorous. He kept flight logs. He kept sun tables. He kept a laminated card in the truck with the solar azimuth for Pickett County for every week of the year, because a shadow is a clock nobody thinks to reset. He photographed his own house every spring, interior and exterior, full scan, because he'd learned in year 2 of the business that the man who has a dated record of his own property is the man who wins the argument, and he'd made it a habit the way other men change the batteries in a smoke detector. Nobody in his family understood why he did that. His wife had mocked it, gently, for 9 years. In the second week of September, it would turn out to be the single most valuable thing he owned. The other most valuable thing he owned was 46 acres on the north bend of the Ferris, and it was not valuable to him for any of the reasons it was valuable to everyone else. His father, Abner Bellamy, had bought it in 1979 for $11,000 because it had an old ferry landing on it, and Abner liked the idea of owning a place where people used to cross. Abner ran a small excavating outfit, buried 2 wives, taught his son to read water, and died in 2019 of something ordinary in a hospital in Cape Girardeau. His ashes went into the river off the end of the landing on a Tuesday, in the rain, with 9 people present. Truett kept the place. He mowed the approach twice a summer. He let the Pickett County Youth Rowing Club, 11 kids, 2 elderly coaches, and 4 boats held together by optimism, use the landing for $1 a year. And he had the lease drawn up properly by a lawyer because his father had taught him that a handshake is a beautiful thing that dies with the people shaking. The ferry place, everyone called it, It was also, according to 3 separate core sampling reports, sitting on top of a sand and gravel deposit of a quality that made men in Jefferson City sit up straight. Truett had married Marlo Vandergrift in a tent on that landing in 2014. She was 39 now, and she was, by any fair accounting, an impressive woman. She'd grown up in the biggest house on Wisteria Street, gone to Mizzou, come back with a marketing degree and a talent for making a room organize itself around her. She had run the county fair board for 6 years and made it profitable, which nobody had done since the 80s. She could remember what your mother had been sick with. She was funny at other people's expense, in a way that made you want to be on her side. Their daughter Odessa was 8. Odessa was a small, watchful, deeply serious person who at 4 had started keeping a notebook of things she considered unfair, and at 8 had filled 2 of them. She could name every bird on the river. She was the kind of child who corrects adults quietly, once, and then lets it go. Their son Holt was 5, and Holt was the opposite, a warm, loud, uncomplicated animal who loved his sister, tractors, and being carried. He had a stuffed heron named Big Guy, and the marriage had been dying for about 3 years in a way that neither of them had been willing to say out loud, because saying it out loud is expensive and silence is free. The Vandergrifts were not rich the way people in Hollow Spring imagined. They were rich the way a lot of small-town families are rich, which is to say they owned things. Buildings on the square, a strip of frontage on the state highway, 400 acres in 2 counties, and had almost no cash. Rowena Vandergrift, Marlo's mother, was 67, a widow, and the actual center of gravity. She had a way of saying, "Well, that's a choice," that had shaped the personalities of 3 children. Thatcher Vandergrift, Marlo's older brother, was 44 and a commercial land broker in Cape Girardeau, which meant he wore good shoes and drove 100 miles a day and had not closed a deal in 14 months. He had a boat payment and a second mortgage and a habit of describing arrangements as, obviously, the smart play. And for 3 years, all of them had been circling the ferry place. Kelvern Sand and Gravel was the second largest aggregate producer in the state, and Kelvern had a problem. Their Pickett County reserve was 7 years from played out. There was a new deposit 2 miles upriver. They had the mineral rights, and the whole thing was worth something north of $40 million over the life of the pit, except there was no way to get the material to water. Every haul route out of that deposit ran through a county road with 2 bridges rated too light for loaded tandems. Except one. There was exactly one place on that stretch of the Ferris with a stable bank, a hard bottom, and an existing graded approach that a barge landing could be built on for a fraction of what it would cost anywhere else. The old ferry landing, Truett Bellamy's 46 acres. They started at $400,000 in 2023. By the spring of 2026, they were at $2,600,000 for a straight purchase, or a 30-year lease with a royalty structure that Thatcher had computed at $4.1 million and had computed out loud, at a dinner table, more than once. Truett said no every time, and he said it the same way, which people found infuriating, politely, briefly, without argument, and without moving. He wasn't being sentimental about it in the way they accused him of. He'd thought it through. There was one public place left on that river where a kid whose family didn't own water could put a boat in, and it was his, and it cost him about $600 a year in mowing and insurance to keep it that way. His father's ashes were in the water off the end of it. 11 kids rode there on Tuesdays and Saturdays. He had a lease with them, drawn up properly. He also knew exactly what a barge landing does to a bank, because measuring what heavy equipment does to ground was literally his job. And here is the thing that made all of it possible. The ferry place was not marital property. Abner had deeded it to Truett in 2011, 3 years before the wedding. It had never been retitled, never been mortgaged, never had $1 of joint money spent on it. In Missouri, that is about as separate property gets. Marlo could divorce him tomorrow and walk away with half of everything they'd built together, and she could not touch 1 square foot of it. Cassius Elridge was the land agent Kelvern had put on the account in early 2025. Cass was 44, from Louisville, and very good at his job, which consisted almost entirely of becoming a person that people in small towns liked. He sponsored the youth baseball teams. He bought rounds. He learned names. He and Marlo Bellamy had been sleeping together since the previous October. Truett didn't know that in September. What he knew was a list of small wrongnesses he had filed away without understanding. The way you notice a hairline crack in a foundation and think, I should look at that. She'd stopped fighting with him in March. That was the first one, and it should have been the loudest. For 6 years they had fought about the same 4 things in the same 3 rooms, and then one day it just stopped, and she started being pleasant to him in a general way, like a good hotel. She'd started asking questions about his day that she wrote down, not in a suspicious way. She'd be making coffee and say, "So what time did you get to the Hendren job?" And then later he'd see a note on the counter in her handwriting, a date and a time and a few words, and she'd say it was for the insurance thing. In June, Odessa had started coming out of her mother's room at night and getting into bed with her brother, which she hadn't done since she was 5. Truett asked her about it twice. The first time she said she had a dream. The second time she said, "Mom and me were practicing." And then she looked at him, and her whole face closed like a door, and she said, "For a play." There was no play. He'd checked with the school, gently, in July, and Ms. Hargitay said there wasn't a play until spring, and Truett had thought, kids are strange, and let it go. He would think about that afternoon for the rest of his life. In August, a woman he didn't know had been at the house twice. Marlo said she was a consultant helping with the Fair Board's rebrand. She had a leather bag and a soft voice, and she brought a tin of buttermints, which Odessa mentioned, once, because Odessa noticed everything and reported almost none of it. On the 10th of September, a Tuesday, Odessa was doing homework at the kitchen island and reached for a glass and knocked her mother's laptop off the counter. It landed on the corner, on tile. The screen came up with a black bloom in the lower left and a spider of cracks running up through it. Odessa cried so hard she got sick. Marlo was in Springfield for 2 days at a conference, and Truett did what he always did, which was to say, hey, it's a screen, screens are the cheapest part, and put it in the truck. On Thursday morning, the 12th of September, he carried it into Kovich Computer Repair at 9:40 in the morning, filled out a work order, wrote his wife's name and his own phone number, checked the box that said the shop was authorized to power on and test the device, and signed it. That signature, that boring, 3-second, unremarkable signature on a carbon copy repair ticket, is the reason this story has the ending it has. Milo Kovac had come to Hollow Spring in 2009 by a route that made no sense to anybody. Belgrade, then Vienna, then a data center outside Chicago, then a divorce, then a for sale sign on a narrow storefront on a Missouri square. He had fixed the Bellamy's devices for 10 years. He had been to Odessa's birthday party. He kept a jar of dog biscuits by the register for a beagle that had died in 2022, and he still hadn't moved the jar. He had the replacement panel by 11. It was an ordinary job. He seated the new display, ran the cable, closed the bezel, and powered it on to do the thing he always did, which is the thing every repair tech does and nobody thinks about. He had to look at the screen to know if the screen worked. The machine came up into a session that had never been logged out, and because he needed a full-color image to check for dead pixels and backlight bleed, he opened the photo viewer, which opened where it had last been left. It opened in a folder named Odessa. Milo looked at the first image for about 2 seconds. Then he looked at the next 11, and then he stopped, and he sat back on his stool, and he did not touch the trackpad again for a long time. He would testify later, under oath, about what he did in the next 4 minutes, and every word of it would hold up, because he had done the one thing that made all of it survivable. He had done nothing except look. There were 41 photographs. They were of a child's arm, and a child's calf, and a child's back below the shoulder blade. There were 4 of a splintered doorframe, and 2 of a hole in drywall about the size of a fist at about the height of a grown man's shoulder. There was a document file, 61 pages, called Journal. Milo could see the file's own dates in the viewer's sidebar without opening anything, because that is how a file browser works. The document had been created at 9:14 on a Sunday morning in April, and it had been modified 11 times, and the most recent modification was 4 days ago. The text inside it, which he could see the first page of, began, March 4th, 2024. I am writing this because I am afraid, and I want a record. 900 Days of a Woman's Private Terror, all typed in one sitting, 17 months after the first entry claimed to have happened. There was an audio file named Interview Practice 3, and there was a spreadsheet. Milo Kovac was a systems man. He had spent his life in the specific belief that the story a machine tells about itself is more honest than the story a person tells about a machine. He looked at the spreadsheet the longest. It had a tab called Sequence. It had 44 rows. Each row had a date, a time, a location, a set of initials, and a column headed Position. Row 38 said, Confirm ex parte filed AM, NG. Row 39 said, OP served at office, do not serve at residence. Row 40 said AMDS confirms O plus H at school, LD notified. Row 41 said, 3:15 p.m., PCE pickup line, LD present, JS position, NE, corner lot, do not intervene, photograph refusal. And the date in the first cell of row 41 was the 12th of September. Milo looked at the calendar on the wall behind his register, which was a free one from the propane company, and the 12th of September was that day, and it was 11:38 in the morning. He picked up the phone and called Truett Bellamy and said, Your wife's machine, there's something wrong with it. Can you come now? Truett was on a job site in the next county, 40 minutes away, standing on a warehouse roof with a controller in his hands. He said, Is it going to cost more than the screen? Milo said, Please come now. At 12:26, Truett walked into the shop, and Milo turned the open sign around, locked the front door, and said, Come in the back, shut the door. Milo's hands were shaking. Truett noticed that first, before anything, because in 10 years he had watched this man solder a component the size of a grain of rice. I'm going to show you something, Milo said. But first, do not pick your kids up from school today. Somebody else has to. Do you understand me? Not you. Truett said, What did you find? And Milo turned the laptop around and said, This, in a folder with your daughter's name on it. There is a thing that happens to a certain kind of man in a moment like that, and it is not what people expect. Truett Bellamy did not shout. He did not put his hand through the drywall of Milo Kovac's back room. He stood absolutely still and read. And what he was actually doing, he would say this later and people would find it strange, was reading it professionally. Because he had spent 19 years being handed photographs by people who wanted him to believe a thing about them. And the first question was never, is this shocking? The first question was always, when was this taken? And where was it taken? And who took it? He looked at the photographs of the bruises for a long time. Then he said, quietly, That's not our doorframe. Milo said, What? That doorframe. The casing's Ogie profile. Ours is a colonial. And there's a 4-inch baseboard in that photo. Ours is 3 1/4. I scanned my own house in April. He said it flatly, like a man reading a serial number, and then he sat down on a milk crate in the back room of a computer repair shop in Hollow Spring, Missouri, and put his hands over his face for about 40 seconds. And then he took them away and said, Okay, what time is it? It was 12:51. He had 2 hours and 24 minutes, and he made 4 phone calls. The first was to his sister Tess, who was an ER nurse in Cape Girardeau, and who was, at that moment, asleep after a night shift. He said 11 sentences, and she said, I'm leaving now. The second was to a lawyer in Poplar Bluff named Imogen Afalabi, whose name he had from a fence line case 3 years earlier, and who was the only attorney he'd ever met who had told him a thing he didn't want to hear on the first call. He got her paralegal, then her, and he talked for 6 minutes, and she said, Do not go to that school. Do not go home. Do not call your wife. Are you writing this down? The third was to Milo, from the parking lot, 30 feet away, to say a sentence Imogen had told him to say word for word. I am not asking you to do anything with that machine. I'm asking you to do what your own conscience and the law require, and to keep your receipt. And the fourth was to Pickett County Elementary, and then he drove there and sat in the front office. He did not go to the pickup line. He sat in Principal Darla Womack's office at 1:50 in the afternoon with a folder on his knees and said, I need 3 things in writing, and I need them today. And he asked for a copy of the school's visitor log for the last 60 days, a copy of the authorized pickup roster with its change history, and a written note of this meeting with the time on it. And then he told Womack, plainly, what he expected to happen at 3:15, and that if any person arrived with a document about his children, she should call the number on the card and not release the children to anybody. Darla Womack had been a principal for 19 years and had heard a great many things in that office. She said, "Mr. Bellamy, I've known Odessa since she was 4. Sit down." At 3:09, a Pickett County Sheriff's deputy named Lowell Driscoll parked on the west side of the lot with an envelope on his passenger seat. He was there because he'd been told there was an order, and there was not yet an order, and he would spend the next year being furious about that in a quiet way. At 3:11, a young man named Jory Slade parked a gray Elantra at the northeast corner of the lot, rolled his window down 4 inches, and rested a camera with a 300mm lens on a beanbag on the door. At 3:15, the doors opened, and 240 children came out into the sun. Truett Bellamy was not in the pickup line. Truett Bellamy was standing inside the front office, 20 feet behind glass, next to the principal, holding his daughter's backpack, while his sister Tess signed both children out at the interior desk on a form with a timestamp on it. The photographer sat at the northeast corner for 51 minutes and photographed nothing at all. The camera on the northeast corner of the school building, however, mounted in 2021, photographed him the entire time. That night, Truett Bellamy drove his 2 children to his sister's house in Cape Girardeau with a duffel bag he'd packed in 11 minutes from the laundry room, because he never went back inside the main part of the house. He took both kids, and they never went back to that house again. The next 72 hours were the worst of Truett Bellamy's life, and they were also, in a way he could not appreciate at the time, the 72 hours in which he won. At 4:40 on the afternoon of the 12th, Milo Kovac walked across the square to the Pickett County Sheriff's Department, laid a work order on the counter, and told a civilian clerk that in the course of a repair, he had observed photographs of an injured child on a customer's device. He also called the Missouri Child Abuse and Neglect Hotline, which he had looked up on a poster in the courthouse hallway, and he read the reference number off the screen and wrote it on the back of the work order. He did not copy a single file. He did not email anything to anybody. He did not send Truett a photograph of any of it. He put the laptop in a static bag, sealed it with tape, wrote the date and the time and his initials across the seal, put it in the safe under the register, and told the deputy where it was. And the reason none of that could be undone later, the reason no defense lawyer could ever get it thrown out, was a signature on a repair ticket. Marlo Bellamy's laptop had been brought in by her husband, who was a joint owner of the household, on a form that authorized the shop to power on and test the device. Milo had a lawful right to be looking at that screen. Once he was lawfully looking, what he saw was his to report. The most expensive thing in this story cost $40 in labor and a piece of carbon paper. They filed anyway. Of course they did. The machine was already moving, and there were too many people in it. On the morning of Monday the 15th, an attorney named Nevin Garrow walked into the Pickett County Circuit Court at 8:31 and filed a petition for dissolution of marriage, a motion for emergency temporary custody, and an application for an adult order of protection on behalf of Marlo Bellamy, and, as next friend, on behalf of the minor children OB and HB. The petition alleged 11 incidents over 29 months. It attached 16 photographs. It attached a 2-page letter from a licensed marital and family therapist, Dr. Aubrey Montford, stating that she had met with Marlo Bellamy on 4 occasions and had observed presentation consistent with sustained coercive control, and that in her clinical opinion, the children's safety required immediate separation from the father. It attached the journal. Judge Orlando Pettigrew read it in chambers, as judges do, on a Monday morning, with 14 other files on the desk and a docket starting at 9, and he did what almost any judge in America would do with that document in front of him, and nobody there to contradict it. He granted it ex parte. He gave Marlo Bellamy temporary sole custody, ordered Truett Bellamy to have no contact with his children pending a hearing, and set the hearing for the 26th. 11 days. At 11:20 that Monday, Truett Bellamy, standing in his sister's kitchen in Cape Girardeau with his son on his hip, was served with papers by a process server who apologized twice. He read them, Then he read the journal, which was 61 pages, and which described a version of him that was so specific, and so intimate, and so nearly right, that it took him a long time to understand what he was actually looking at. Because it wasn't fiction. That was the horror of it. 9/10 of it was true. The night he'd come home at 1 a.m. from a flood mapping job in Scott County and slammed a cabinet, that had happened. The 4th of July when he'd told her to get out of the truck, that had happened, and he'd been wrong, and he'd apologized for a week. The time he'd taken her phone out of her hand, he had done that, in 2022, in an argument about her mother. Every entry was a real moment. Every entry had had one thing removed and one thing added. What had been removed was the context. What had been added was a child in the doorway. A woman had gone through 9 years of an ordinary, imperfect, occasionally ugly marriage, kept every real grievance, stripped each one down to its worst 30 seconds, and then, in one Sunday morning, in a single sitting, on the 14th of April, typed all of them out with a child written into the frame of every single one. Truett said one thing when he finished it. He said, she was taking notes for a year and a half. The hearing on the 26th went badly. Imogen Afolabi had been in the case 11 days. She had no expert, no forensic interview, no discovery, and a client whose entire defense at that stage was, I didn't do it. Nevin Garrow put Marlo Bellamy on the stand for 50 minutes, and she was extraordinary. Not theatrical, not weepy, just tired and steady and reluctant, which is a much harder performance and a much more convincing one. She cried exactly once, at the right moment, about a door frame. Dr. Montford testified by telephone for 11 minutes. Judge Pettigrew continued the temporary orders. He gave Truett Bellamy 2 hours of supervised visitation per week at a family access center in Poplar Bluff, at Truett's expense, and he set a full hearing for the 2nd week of January. 4 months. That is what it looks like from the inside, and it is important to sit in it for a second, because a lot of people watching will assume the truth is a kind of gravity that pulls everything toward it on its own. It is not. Truth is a thing somebody has to carry uphill, and on the 26th of September, Truett Bellamy walked out of a courthouse having been declared, on paper, a danger to his own children, by a decent judge doing his honest job with a stack of manufactured evidence in front of him. The first supervised visit was on a Tuesday, in a beige room with a 2-way window and a bin of donated toys, with a supervisor named Cheryl on a folding chair by the door, writing. Holt did not understand any of it and was simply glad. He climbed on his father and said, "Big guy misses you," and pressed a stuffed heron against Truett's face. Odessa stood by the door for 11 minutes. Then she came and sat next to him on the carpet, and she did not look at him, and she said, at a volume calculated exactly to reach him and not the woman by the door, "I told them I don't remember. I said it every time. Dad, I said it every time." Truett Bellamy said, "I know you did. You're not in trouble. You're not in any trouble at all." And Odessa Bellamy, 8 years old, keeper of 2 notebooks of things that were unfair, said, "The lady with the mints wrote it down anyway." Truett Bellamy went back to Cape Girardeau that night, sat down in his sister's spare bedroom at a card table, and started doing the only thing he had ever been good at. He had 16 photographs. In Discovery, in October, he would get all 41. And a photograph, to a man who does photogrammetry for a living, is not a picture. It is a measurement of a place at an instant, and it contains about 9 things the person who took it never thought about. He started with the sun. 3 of the images had been taken outdoors, in the backyard on Shandell Road, and the journal placed all 3 in June. In 2 of them there was a shadow, the shadow of the fence post at the corner of the deck, falling across the grass, and in 1 there was the shadow of the photographer. Truett had a laminated card in his truck. He also had 19 years of habit. He pulled the solar position tables for latitude 37.2 north, and he measured the shadow of that fence post, and the fence post was 41 inches tall, and had been 41 inches tall since he set it in 2018. The shadow in the photograph was 58 inches long, running to the north-northeast. In Pickett County, Missouri, in the 3rd week of June, at any hour of any day, a 41-inch post does not cast a 58-inch shadow to the north-northeast. In June, the sun is high, and the shadows are short, and they do not point that way in the afternoon. They do in the second half of October. Truett computed a solar elevation of 35 degrees and an azimuth that put the sun in the southwest, and he ran it against 4 months of the tables, and he got a window between the 11th and the 28th of October of the previous year, between 3:40 and 4:20 in the afternoon. The journal said June. The Sun said October. And the Sun is the only witness in this entire story that could not be paid, coached, threatened, or subpoenaed. Then he went to the doorframe. He had scanned his own house on the 6th of April. He did it every spring. It had taken him 90 minutes with a handheld scanner and a tripod, and it lived on a drive in the back room of his shop. And every year Marlowe had said some version of, "You are the only man alive who does this." He built the model, and he took the photograph of the splintered doorframe, and he did the thing his profession is actually for. He solved for camera position. Given the geometry visible in the image, the corner of the casing, the baseboard, the width of the door, the line where the wall meets the ceiling, where would a lens have to have been standing to produce that exact image? The answer was 11 inches inside the west wall of his own hallway. Which is to say, that photograph was not taken in his house. It was taken in a room with a wider door, a taller baseboard, and a ceiling 4 inches lower. He found the room in November. It was the guest bathroom hallway of a short-term rental on Lake Wapapello that had been booked for 2 nights in October on a card ending in the last 4 digits that also appeared on a Clearwater invoice. Then he went to the camera. All 41 images had been stripped of their metadata. Someone had run them through a scrubber, which is a thing that takes about 9 seconds and feels, to the person doing it, like being thorough. It is not thorough, because every digital camera has a sensor, and every sensor has flaws, and those flaws are stamped into every single frame that camera has ever taken, whether the file remembers where it came from or not. Truett found a stuck pixel. Green channel, 31% up from the bottom edge, 44% in from the left. It was in all 41 photographs. It was also in a photograph of a bruise on the calf of a child in a rental house on Lake Wapapello. And it was also, and this is where a careful man becomes a dangerous one, in 162 images, posted publicly on the portfolio website of a wedding and portrait photographer in Cape Girardeau named Jory Slade. The same camera took Odessa Bellamy's bruises and the Renfro Delacroix wedding. And then Truett found the thing that made a forensic pathologist laugh out loud 10 weeks later, in a deposition. Image 11 and image 29 showed the same bruise, same shape, same 3-lobed edge, same little constellation of freckles beside it, on opposite arms. Somebody had flipped the picture. Dewey Strand, who was 29 and had worked for Truett for 4 years, and who spent that autumn quietly doing all of the actual paying work of the company by himself, said the smartest thing anyone said in the whole case. He looked at the 2 mirrored images on the card table in Tess's spare bedroom and said, they didn't think anybody would ever look at these. They thought people would just feel about them. That was exactly right. The entire package, the journal, the letter, the photographs, the coached child, was engineered for an 11-minute hearing in front of a tired judge. It was built to be felt, once, quickly, and then never examined again. It was not built to survive a man with a sun table. On the 9th of November, Imogen Afolabi filed a motion to compel production of the original image files, the device that had created them, and every communication between Marlowe Bellamy and any third party regarding the preparation of the exhibits. Nevin Garrow objected on 9 grounds. Judge Orlando Pettigrew, who had been sitting with a bad feeling in his stomach since September and could not have told you why, granted it in full. The audio file was the thing that changed the size of the case. It was in the state's hands, not Truett's, and he did not hear it until December, in a conference room with a detective named Merritt Kazanjian, and a victim advocate, and his lawyer, and a box of tissues nobody used. It was 4 minutes and 9 seconds long, and it was named Interview Practice 3. A woman's voice, warm, unhurried, close to the microphone, and a child's voice further away. Okay, sweetheart, one more. Where were you standing? In the hall. In the hallway. And what did you see? A pause of about 4 seconds. I don't remember. That's all right. Let's try it the way we practiced. You were in the hallway, and you saw Daddy. And then what does Daddy do with his hands? Another pause. Do I have to? Nobody's making you do anything, honey. We're just practicing so you're not scared. Try it again. And this time, don't say, Mommy told me. Just say what you saw. Detective Kazanjian stopped the recording there, and Truett Bellamy said, Play the rest. The rest was the same thing 3 more times, and at the end of it the woman's voice said, That was perfect. Do you want a mint? And Truett said, Who is she? The voice belonged to Dina Shaughnessy, of Overland Park, Kansas, who was 52 years old, who had a bachelor's degree in communications, who held no license of any kind in any state, and who for 11 years had operated a company called Clearwater Family Transitions. Clearwater's website was tasteful and vague. Soft focus photographs of a woman looking out a window. Phrases like, narrative strategy for high conflict separations, and we help you be heard. A contact form. No prices. The prices were on the invoices. $18,500 in 3 payments for something called the full transition package. And the invoice in the Odessa folder was numbered 0731. That number is the whole second half of this story. Truett Bellamy looked at 0731 and thought a thought that separates the people who win from the people who merely survive. He thought, this isn't the first one. He could not subpoena anything. He wasn't a prosecutor. But there is a thing about American courts that most people never think about, and it is the single most powerful research tool available to an ordinary citizen. Almost all of it is public. Ex parte orders of protection are filed in circuit courts. Circuit court filings are indexed online in Missouri, and in Kansas, and in Arkansas, and in Illinois. You cannot always read the whole file, but you can read a lot of them, and you can absolutely read the ones people forgot to seal. Truett Bellamy spent the winter of that year doing at night what he did in the day, pattern matching. He built a spreadsheet of his own. Every ex parte custody petition filed in 11 counties across 4 states over 6 years by a petitioner represented by one of 6 attorneys whose names appeared in Clearwater's own site metadata. He read them. He read hundreds of them. And then he found the sentence. He has never physically struck me in a way that left a mark, which is why I have not called the police before now, and which is why I am afraid no one will believe this. It is a very good sentence. It is a beautiful sentence, actually. It explains away the absence of evidence, the absence of a report, and the absence of witnesses in 29 words, and it makes the reader feel like a person who is finally being trusted. It appeared, word for word, in 14 petitions across 6 years in 4 states. It appeared on page 2 of Marlowe Bellamy's. By February, Truett had 11 names and had spoken to 4 of them. 2 hung up. 1, a woman named Katrin Vosberg in Joplin, listened for 10 minutes and then said, I paid that woman $9,000, and I have never been so ashamed of anything in my life. And she agreed to talk to a federal agent. And 1 was a man named Damian Folks. Damian Folks was a 46-year-old HVACSEAESES installer from Neosho, Missouri, who in 2020 had been the subject of an ex parte order, supported by a journal, 7 photographs, and a letter from a therapist. He had lost his house, his job, $61,000, and 4 years of his son's childhood. He had done everything wrong, in the sense that he had done everything a normal, terrified, innocent person does. He had gone to the school. He had gone to the house. He had called 40 times in one night. He had, in short, walked into every single frame the package was built to photograph. He had a felony violation conviction. He saw his son 8 hours a month. When Truett Bellamy called him and read him the 29-word sentence out of his own petition, Damian Folks was quiet for a long time and then said, "Say that again." That was the moment the thing stopped being a custody case. Because a woman lying about her husband in a Missouri circuit court is a state matter, and a bad one, and it might get her probation, but a business that sells manufactured evidence packages to clients in 4 states, takes payment by wire, coaches children on recorded audio, and buys favorable letters from a licensed clinician is something else entirely. That is a conspiracy. That is wire fraud. That is witness tampering. And when the manufactured evidence includes injuries deliberately inflicted on a child in order to be photographed, that is not a filing. That is an assault, 41 times. In March, an assistant United States attorney in the Eastern District of Missouri, named Tobin Vestergaard, opened a file. The bruises were the last thing anybody wanted to look at closely, and they were the thing that ended it. Dr. Sonova Broch was a forensic pediatrician at a children's hospital in St. Louis, who had spent 22 years being the person who says whether an injury on a child is what somebody claims it is. She was given the 41 photographs in January, and she wrote 11 pages. Real bruises do a thing. They are three-dimensional. They have a center of maximum injury, and they fade outward, and they change color on a schedule the body does not negotiate. Red-purple in the first day, blue-black by the third, green around the fifth, yellow-brown by the eighth. 11 of the 41 photographs were, in Dr. Broch's words, consistent with mechanically induced subcutaneous petechial injury of a pattern typical of low-grade suction cupping, a circular device held to the skin that pulls a perfect ring of broken capillaries with a suspiciously clean margin and no core. 9 were makeup, applied well, but photographed in daylight, and enlarged to 1100%. An alcohol-activated cream palette does not hold up. There were brush strokes. And 6 of them, 6, were real, and they were the ones that made Dr. Broch put her pen down and go for a walk. They were fingertip bruises on the upper arm, and the spacing was wrong for a man of Truett Bellamy's handspan. It was right for a woman's. Odessa Bellamy was interviewed properly on the 8th of January at a child advocacy center in Cape Girardeau by a trained forensic interviewer, on video, with no parent in the building and nobody feeding questions through an earpiece. She talked for 51 minutes. She was, as she had always been, extremely precise. She said the lady with the mints came 11 times, always when Dad was at work. She said the first few times they just talked, and it was nice. She said the lady told her they were making a story to help Mom not be sad anymore, and that it was like being in a play, and that Odessa had a really important part. She said the pinching was on Wednesdays because Wednesday was when Dad worked late. She said, I told her I don't remember, every time. I said it every time, and she just wrote something different. And then she said the sentence that 11 adults in 3 agencies would repeat to each other for a year. I thought if I said it wrong enough times, they would stop asking. Dr. Aubrey Montford, Lomeft, folded on the second interview. She had never met the children. She had never observed a single interaction. She had met Marlo Bellamy 4 times, and the letter she had signed had arrived in her inbox already written, as a Word document, from Dina Shaughnessy, with a note that said, "Here's the draft we discussed. Please put it on your letterhead." She had been paid $2,000, which had been described as a records fee. She had done the same thing 8 times in 6 years and had never once considered herself part of anything. That is how these machines actually work. Almost nobody in them believes they are doing the bad thing. Each person does one small, deniable, well-compensated piece and hands it to the next person. Jory Slade, 29, photographer, was arrested on a Tuesday morning in Cape Girardeau and gave up everything he had in about 40 minutes, which included a memory card he had never wiped because it had a shoot on it he'd been meaning to invoice. And in the state's forensic image of Marlo Bellamy's laptop was a file that had never been opened by anybody but its author. It was in the Odessa folder. It was named after. It was 2 pages, and it was a term sheet, and it read like what it was, a plan for how the rest of a life would be divided once a man had been removed from it. Paragraph 3 said that upon entry of a permanent parenting plan, petitioner's counsel will advise the prosecuting attorney that petitioner does not wish to pursue the criminal referral. Paragraph 5 said that respondent would execute the Kelvern sand and gravel mineral lease on the North Bend parcel, together with an access easement, as consideration. Paragraph 7 allocated the royalty, 40% to Marlo Bellamy, 20% to R. Vandergrift, 10% as a consulting fee to Clearwater Family Transitions, and a broker's commission on the front end to T. Vandergrift. There it was, in a font, on a page, in a folder named after an 8-year-old girl. The children were the consideration. The land was the closing. And Truett Bellamy, reading it in Imogen Afolabi's conference room in Poplar Bluff on a gray afternoon in March, understood the last piece. Nobody in this had actually wanted his children. Odessa and Holt were not the prize. They were the price tag. The entire $18,500 apparatus existed to create a man so frightened of never seeing his kids again that he would sign anything put in front of him, and then to hand him a pen. He also understood, finally, about Cassius Elridge, because there were 411 text messages, and there was a rental on Lake Wapapello booked for 2 nights in October under a company card, and there was a photograph of a fence post casting a 58-inch shadow in the wrong month, taken in a backyard on Chandel Road on an afternoon when Truett Bellamy was flying a levee survey 90 miles away. Imogen Afolabi said, "We can end this in January. We have enough." And Truett Bellamy said, January isn't enough, because he had learned something in 6 months of reading other people's petitions. Every single one of the 11 families had a case that could have been won on paper. 9 of them never got to paper. They got to a hallway, and a settlement, and a signature, and an arrangement everyone called reasonable, and Dina Shaughnessy walked away every time with a fee and no fingerprints. Truett had proof of what had been done to him. He did not yet have proof of what she said when she thought she had won. So he built them something to walk into. It took 5 weeks, and it had 4 parts. And the elegant thing about it, the thing that made Tobin Vestergaard sit back in his chair and say, "Well, hell," is that every single part of it was legal. And 3 of the 4 parts were things Truett Bellamy did in the ordinary course of his own business. The first part was the collapse. In the first week of April, Truett stopped fighting. He told Imogen to ask for a continuance. He let a payment lapse on the supervised visitation center and had to be reminded. He missed a filing deadline by a day. He was seen at Rose on the square at 9 in the morning on a Wednesday, unshaven, not eating. And he called Thatcher Vandergrift. Not Marlowe, not the lawyer. Thatcher, because Thatcher was the weak seal in the whole vessel, a man with a boat payment who could not hold a secret through 1 cup of coffee, and because a message delivered through a greedy relative arrives pre-believed. Truett said 11 sentences, and then said the one that mattered. "I'm done, Thatch. I want my kids. Tell them I'll sign the lease. But I want it done at the ferry place, with everybody there, and I'm not signing anything until somebody looks me in the face and tells me exactly what I'm getting for it." Thatcher Vandergrift called his sister within 9 minutes. The second part was the advertisement. In the second week of April, Bellamy Aerial and Survey ran a 1/4-page notice in the Pickett County Register and posted the same notice at the courthouse and the co-op, as required, announcing that on the 29th of April it would be conducting a low-altitude aerial mapping survey of the North Bend parcel and adjacent river frontage in connection with a proposed shoreline improvement, and giving the flight window as 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. He filed the flight plan. He notified the county. He did every dull, documented, statutory thing a surveyor does before a mapping mission, and he did it in public, 3 weeks in advance, in a newspaper, under his own name. Which is how you fly a drone over 4 people for 2 hours and 40 minutes and photograph all of it, every 2 seconds, with a GPS coordinate and an atomic clock timestamp burned into every single frame, and have it be, in the eyes of every court in America, exactly what it looks like. A man doing his job on his own land, having told everyone in advance. The third part was the tailgate. Missouri is a one-party consent state. Truett Bellamy did not wear a wire, did not have a hidden device, did not conceal anything. He drove his own truck to his own land, dropped the tailgate, set his phone face up on the metal next to a thermos and a stack of papers in a manila folder, and left it there in plain view for anybody with functioning eyes to see, and pressed record. The fourth part was the folder. Because a person about to close a deal wants to see the deal. Truett had Imogen prepare a genuine, executable, entirely real Kelvern sand and gravel, 30-year mineral lease, with the access easement attached. Every page correct, signature line blank, and underneath it, a genuine consent parenting plan, giving Marlo Bellamy primary physical custody. Both documents were real. That was the point. Nothing about the 29th of April was a fake except the man holding the pen. They came at 2 in the afternoon. Marlo came in Cass Elridge's car, which told Truett something before anyone said a word. Thatcher came in his own, and Dina Shaughnessy drove down from Overland Park in a silver crossover and got out with a leather bag and a tin of buttermints in the side pocket. The rowing club's 4 boats were pulled up on the grass under a tarp because it was a Wednesday. 400 feet above them, a survey quadcopter flew a lawnmower pattern, and it had been flying it for an hour, and nobody looked up at it even once, because it had been announced in a newspaper, and everybody in Pickett County had seen Truett Bellamy fly one of those for 9 years, and it was the single most boring object within a mile. Truett let it run for 20 minutes. He was awful. He was ashamed and small and desperate, and he could not look at his wife. And Dina Shaughnessy watched it with the specific pleasure of a professional whose work has come out well. He signed nothing. He held the pen and he said, "Before I do this, I need to hear it. Straight. What am I getting?" And Dina Shaughnessy, who had done this 11 times and had never once been recorded, put her hand on the folder and said, kindly, the way you'd explain a mortgage. "Truett, you're getting your children back. That's what you're purchasing. I want to be very direct with you, because I think you've earned that. The custody is the consideration. The lease is the closing. Once the parenting plan is entered, the criminal referral goes away. Marlowe simply tells the prosecutor she doesn't wish to proceed. Everything else is paperwork," Truett said. "And the photographs?" And Dina Shaughnessy said, "Nobody ever looks at photographs again after a case settles. That's the whole point of settling." Then Marlowe Bellamy, who had spent 9 years married to this man and 8 years being Odessa's mother, said, "She'll be fine. True, she's 8. She'll forget the whole thing by Christmas." Truett Bellamy put the pen down on the tailgate. He said, "She won't. She keeps notebooks." And then he said the only unplanned sentence of the entire afternoon, and it was very quiet. "Dad's out there in that water, and you all drove down here to buy him." Cassius Elridge understood first. He looked at the phone on the tailgate for about 2 seconds, and then he looked up at the sky, at the small white thing turning in its patient rectangle 400 feet over the north bend of the Ferris River, and his face came apart. Federal agents took Dina Shaughnessy at a Kansas travel plaza 11 days later with a laptop in the passenger footwell. The ex parte order was dissolved on the 6th of May. Judge Orlando Pettigrew did it from the bench, without a hearing, in about 90 seconds. And then he did something judges almost never do. He kept the courtroom open. He waited for the room to be quiet, and he said, on the record, that in 19 years he had never been more comprehensively deceived, that the fault for that was his own for the 11 minutes he had given the file in September, and that he would be recommending changes to how this circuit handled emergency applications. It is in the transcript. Damian Folks has a printed copy of that paragraph in a frame in his kitchen. Odessa and Holt Bellamy came home to a rented house on the east side of Cape Girardeau because their father had not set foot in the house on Shondell Road since the 12th of September and never would again on the 7th of May. The dispositions took 2 years. Dina Shaughnessy went to trial because people like Dina Shaughnessy always go to trial. She believed, right up to the verdict, that she was the smartest person in the building. The government put on 31 witnesses, 4 families, 2 forensic pediatricians, a photographer, 3 therapists, and a 4-minute audio recording of a woman teaching an 8-year-old girl how to describe her father's hands. The jury was out for 5 hours. Conspiracy, wire fraud across 4 states, witness tampering, and 11 counts related to the injuries inflicted on children in order to photograph them. 19 years. She is 55 now. Marlowe Bellamy pled. There was nothing else to do. Her voice was on the tailgate recording, and her fingertips were on her daughter's arm. Conspiracy, perjury, endangering the welfare of a child in the first degree. 8 years. Her parental rights were terminated in a separate proceeding in which her own daughter's forensic interview was played, and Marlowe sat with her face in her hands. Thatcher Vandergrift flipped in the first week and testified for 2 days and got 30 months anyway, which surprised him and which shouldn't have. Rowena Vandergrift wrote the check for $18,500 from her own account in 3 payments. She was 68 years old at the time, and she pled to a conspiracy count and got probation and a fine, and then she discovered the thing that mattered more to her than any of it. In a town of 4,200 people, everybody knew what she had paid for. The Vandergrift name had been on the second pew at First Methodist since 1911. She sold the house on Wisteria Street 11 months later and moved to Arizona. Cassius Elridge pled to obstruction and got 14 months. Kelvern Sand and Gravel fired him by email and issued a statement using the phrase, "the independent conduct of a former contractor," 4 separate times. Their Pickett County expansion was abandoned in the spring of the following year. The reserve is still in the ground, and the barge landing was never built. Nevin Garrow was disbarred. Dr. Aubrey Montford surrendered her license and now sells real estate. Jory Slade served 11 months and gave up his camera, which, because the universe occasionally has a sense of humor, became Exhibit 31, identified by the stuck pixel in its green channel, 31% up from the bottom edge. Deputy Lowell Driscoll was never charged with anything because he had done nothing wrong. He had been told there was an order. He testified for the government. He also, on his own time, drove to Neosho and apologized to Damian Folks for something he'd had no part in, which tells you most of what you need to know about him. Damian Folks had his conviction vacated in the second year. He got his son back in August, at 15 years old, 4 years and 4 months after he'd lost him. They are, by all accounts, still figuring it out. Katrin Vosberg testified, and then started a support line, which now takes about 90 calls a month. Milo Kovac testified for 40 minutes, and was, by every account, the least dramatic witness in the trial. He explained a work order. He explained why a technician has to look at a screen to know a screen works. He explained the static bag and the tape and the initials across the seal. The defense attorney asked him why he hadn't just called his friend and stayed out of it, and Milo Kovac said, "Because I saw the date on the spreadsheet, and the date was that day." He still has the shop on the square. He never sent an invoice for the screen, and the ferry place is still there. Truett Bellamy did not sell it, and he did not keep it either. Exactly. In the autumn after the trial, he put all 46 acres into an irrevocable trust, public access in perpetuity, no extraction of any kind, ever, by anybody, including his own descendants. The rowing club's lease went from $1 a year to 0. There is a limestone block at the top of the ramp with 2 names on it, and the names are Abner Bellamy and, underneath, Milo Kovac, which Milo objected to loudly for about a year and has now stopped mentioning. Truett runs the company. It is 6 people now. He still scans his own house every April, and now 3 of his neighbors ask him to do theirs, and he does it for free and hands them a drive and says, "Put it somewhere that isn't your house." Holt Bellamy is 9. He does not remember most of it, and Big Guy the Heron lost an eye in 2028 and was repaired with a button. Odessa Bellamy is 12. She still keeps notebooks. She rows on Tuesdays and Saturdays out of the landing her grandfather bought for $11,000 in 1979. Her father asked her once, carefully, at the 2-year mark, whether she wanted to talk about any of it, and Odessa thought about it the way she thinks about everything, for slightly too long, and then she said, "I told them the truth 11 times and nobody wrote it down, so I write it down now. That's all." I want to close this one by talking to somebody who isn't watching. Milo, this is for you. You were 53 years old, and you had a shop with a jar of dog biscuits for a dog that died 4 years ago, and on a Thursday morning, you looked at a screen, because that is literally how you check whether a screen works. And then you had about 10 seconds. Here is what your 10 seconds bought. 2 children slept in their own beds 4,000 miles of paperwork later, instead of in a house being used as a set. A man in Neosho got a 15-year-old son back. A woman in Joplin stopped being ashamed. A judge changed how an entire circuit handles a Monday morning. And a 52-year-old woman who had been quietly selling manufactured childhoods for 11 years is going to be 68 when she gets out. You didn't do any of that. You did one thing. You refused to be the 11th person who handled one small deniable piece and passed it down the line. That is the whole mechanism. In every story like this one, it never needs a villain in every chair. It only needs everybody else to decide it isn't their business. So here is the part for the rest of us. 2 things. Make the boring record now, while nothing is wrong. Photograph your own house. Date it. Put the copy somewhere that is not your house. Keep the ordinary receipt, the work order, the sign-in sheet, the visitor log. The dull paper is what beat an $18,000 package, not the dramatic paper. And when your 10 seconds come, and they will, in a doorway or a break room or somebody's kitchen, remember that silence only feels free. Somebody else pays for it. Usually somebody 8 years old, standing in a hallway, telling the truth for the 11th time to a person who is writing down something different.